Good people, welcome again to Peikoff Fridays. It is September. How did September get here so quick? But it's September 2nd. September 2nd, happy Atlas Shrugged Day to all of you good people out there. And apropos of this important day, the day on which Ayn Rand started writing Atlas Shrugged, and for that reason, a date that features throughout the narrative, we are discussing Ayn Rand's novels. We've had enough sex. We've certainly had enough religion. And we've talked about Ayn Rand's life in this fascinating book, Keeping It Real, Bringing Ideas Down to Earth by Leonard Peikoff. But this week, and in honor of Atlas Shrugged Day, we return to Ayn Rand's novels and handpicked by the illustrious James Valliant. We have 6 questions to go over today. James, how are you doing today?
I'm doing spectacularly wonderful today. It is Atlas Shrugged Day, which always puts a smile on my face. So it is the single most important intellectual event in my life was reading Atlas Shrugged. And I think it eclipses every other book I've read, every other brilliant, and I've had the best, most brilliant teachers in the world. It was reading that darn book that expanded my mind more than any other single experience I've had in my entire life. If you haven't read that novel, please check it out.
It is time. It is past time, but especially on September 2nd, a great day to read or reread Atlas Shrugged. It's interesting because the Daily Objective today was outstanding. And they were talking about favorite passages in Atlas Shrugged, apropos of the holiday. Right. And it was interesting because they had to acknowledge it right up front, there's going to be spoilers. You can't say what are the best passages without there being spoilers. But what's amazing about Atlas Shrugged, and I think the Fountainhead too, is how well it bears rereading. It's an exciting book, even if you already know the plot. So that, if there are any spoilers, trust me, they don't spoil.
There are a handful of books that I can return to again and again and again. I could probably count them on one hand. And numero uno, first on that list is Atlas Shrugged, the most infinitely mineable forever book. Every time you go back around it, I don't care if you read it 10, 20 times, you will still get something profound out of it from another reading. At least I do.
Yes.
All I can say.
Yeah. The ideas they're so, they go to so many levels. I think spiral theory, but also even the details of the narrative is so interesting that there are things I swear I've never skipped. I've never skimmed it, but I'll read, the second or third time I read the book, I swear I missed that. I missed that I missed that connection I should have made. So good. So yes, September 2nd is a great day to go back to novels, fiction in general, because you've given us a few really great questions here, some of which, once again, I'm going to say, I don't know if I agreed with that, at least when I first heard it. So I'm going to jump right in with question 1, because Dr. Leonard Peikoff was asked, do great works of art, such as those of Homer or Viktor Hugo or Ayn Rand, tend to inspire philosophical movements? Or is it the reverse? Now, I have to say, before we discuss Leonard, Dr. Peikoff's answer, I think I had the right answer to this one. And it's actually one of those areas I'm a little bit militant about, because although I give primacy to philosophy and I shrug a bit at the great man theory of history, I think it goes both ways. And let's see if I got that right. I was going to say if Leonard Peikoff agrees with me, but it's always presumptuous to phrase anything that way. Let's see if I got anywhere close to the right answer.
I usually put it, do I agree with Leonard Peikoff on this? Yes. Not vice versa.
And even that sounds like I'm saying, am I an idiot or not? Let's find out.
Right.
So Dr. Peikoff answers, I would say it works in both directions, but the philosophy inspiring the art is the primary. Homer rested on a certain kind of philosophy, namely secularism, as his basic outlook, which is what made the whole Greek civilization. If you say Homer was the philosopher who originated a secular approach, well, that's great, and that makes him the genius of the universe, but then he was the philosopher who made possible a secular philosophy that made possible a work of art. You see, he's showing that still, even though Homer was an artist, philosophy came first.
Right.
And of course, Atlas Shrugged presupposed Ayn Rand's philosophy, which she had to develop purely as philosophy first. But once you say philosophy is the primary that makes art possible, there is certainly a reverse influence of that kind of art on culture and philosophy. Now, I'll take a break there from quoting Dr. Peikoff. We have a poll in the chat. The chat looks sparse today. Let's see. Oh, I might have the wrong setting there. Anyway, the poll says, which came first? Great art or great philosophy? Tell us what you think, folks. And let me click my answer there first. Of course, I've kind of already given the spoiler there, haven't I? And Dr. Peikoff goes on, if you know the influence of Homer's epics on Greece, it's tremendous. I have to pause again and say, I have not read Homer, and this was enlightening to me and makes me realize I need to read the original texts and not just the recaps and the cliff notes. If you know the influence of Homer's epics on Greece, it's tremendous. It can't be overestimated. There is an example of art having a tremendous philosophical influence. It is even a question whether Plato or Aristotle could have existed but for Homer. Victor Hugo had less of an influence on culture or philosophy because his philosophy was inconsistent with his novels. Now, as far as Atlas Shrugged, inspiring movements in the culture or in the philosophy, or in philosophy, we'll have to wait and see. And then he wraps up with this. I would say this, art is the greatest disseminator of philosophy that there is. It can produce a cultural effect that philosophic lectures cannot do. Take Uncle Tom's Cabin and the fight against slavery. That book did more than 1,000 tracts against slavery did. It's still true, though, that you can't have the art that's so influential without the philosophy that makes it possible. And that's interesting to me. Now, a close quote from Dr. Peikoff, that he makes the point, and it's almost like the spiral theory. It is it's a back and forth, that the philosophy makes the art possible. The art helps disseminate the philosophy. Those who learn that philosophy or develop it then produce art that continues that cycle.
Right. You know, one historical caution I would have to say, Homer. Homer is the oldest, right? He and perhaps Hesiod are the two oldest European writers whose writings survive. And being at the very headwaters of literature, it is hard for us to determine how original Homer was, you know, because he was coming from an oral context into a written context. That's why the Iliad and the Odyssey are considered the beginning of European literature. So it's hard to know Homer's own originality without knowing his oral tradition predecessors and colleagues. On the other hand, when we get just a little later into literature, like the Greek playwrights like Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides, we do have an understanding of some of their originality because they're inventing drama. Aeschylus is the first person to have an single actor stand out from the chorus. Sophocles has this well-developed drama, and in fact, Aristotle is understanding from a literary critic perspective their work. So we begin to understand the evolution of literature and ideas a little better once that starts. But all that being said, there's no question that Dr. Peikoff is absolutely right. The impact on Homer and classical civilization is hard to underestimate. It was used as a learning tool for young people throughout the Greek and Roman ancient period. One of the reasons why we have so many copies, ancient copies and fragments and so forth, and one of the reasons why Homer survived so ubiquitously is because it was so widely used by Greeks and Romans to educate their children. It was considered the sort of the literary moral basis for moral education. And I have to agree with Peikoff about the secularism of Homer. In Homer, for example, in the Odyssey, Odysseus goes to the underworld. There is an underworld, but it's no fun. It's no fun at all. Achilles, the great hero of the Trojan War, Odysseus meets down in the underworld, and Achilles says to Odysseus said, "Well, you're the great Achilles, and so you must have it really cool down here. You must not be so bad." Achilles' response is, "Oh, my old buddy Odysseus, I would rather be a slave on earth than be Lord here in the underworld." In other words, the Greeks did not look forward to the great release of death like Christians do. Death is not their goal. Some supernatural dimension is not superior to this one. And when you read the rest of Homer, like the Iliad, it's all about achievement and glory. You know, Achilles may be just this glory hound to some extent in the Iliad. You definitely should read Homer. I have to say, Robert, do get around to reading Homer. It's great stuff when you understand its context. But it's about glory and achievement here on Earth. And what Homer does do is talk about this worldly kind of ethics. It's not about some other dimension. It's about success in this world. It's about happiness in this world. What is a more valuable life? Achilles is asked by his goddess mother, a short, glorious life or a long, no one will remember you, you didn't do anything kind of life. And Achilles is opting for that short, glorious life of achievement. So what it does is it wrestles with moral issues about life on Earth, even though it involves a background of religion. And that was obviously a primary cultural influence. And he was writing way before Plato and Aristotle. Homer is kind of setting the cultural conditions that will make the Greek invention of science and philosophy a plausibility. These are people oriented to this world, and you can see it as early as Homer, and it plays out culturally in early Greek culture. They are the people who gave us philosophy and science.
So interestingly enough, the chat is sparse today. We have watchers, and we have folks who have entered our poll, and surprisingly enough, and it looks like Christopher Smith agrees with this, under which came first, we have 80% of people say great art, 20% say great philosophy. Well, again, given that back and forth progression, I guess it depends on how you interpret the question, but I'm having to go with Dr. Peikoff on this one.
Philosophy kind of begins as literature. Before we can do self-conscious philosophy with an objective method, or the start at an objective method like Aristotle gave us, observation and logic and being thoughtful about how we think, and being reality-based in how we think. Before an explicit objective methodology gets developed, there's still all kinds of moral instruction, and it's happening by means of storytelling. If you read stories from the Hebrew Bible, or if you read Aesop's fables from Greek culture, what you're hearing are sort of pre-philosophical approaches to moral lesson telling, to the preserving of moral knowledge that has developed unselfconsciously in very, very primitive times. So in a sense, literature is the first way of approaching ethical discussions, metaphysical discussions, and only when an objective methodology is later discovered do we then have philosophy. Now, is there any substitute for self-conscious philosophy? No. Once you have an objective method, philosophy itself is going to outpace literature in terms of its ability to contribute original ideas and to develop a systematic approach to philosophy. There's no substitute for. Literature can't pinch hit for philosophy at the end of the day. Although, as Peikoff points out here, there is nothing more powerful than telling a philosophy in terms of a fictional story. You'll notice every religion has its myths, even ones that come after the development of self-conscious philosophy. It's almost as though there has to be a Jesus story, and Jesus has to teach in parables, because it is by storytelling, it is by narrative that people, especially children, really can grasp in concrete terms the meaning of a moral lesson. So there's a back and forth. Literature can be more powerful than any nonfiction dry treatise. That nonfiction dry treatise, though, can be way more powerful in terms of getting us to new ideas with clarity and precision and an objective method. That's how I'd put it.
I think you're right, and that's undeniable. I think because the question was put as which came first, art or philosophy, now I'm thinking, well, if you put it that way, there were cave paintings, and then there were stories, and then eventually there were myths well before there was explicit philosophy. So I guess if you take it literally, which came first, okay, I'm going to jump in with the crowd that said great art. Well, no, about great art, but art, definitely.
But when you break it down even on that level, what's the lasting quality of these moral tales? The philosophical element. If these stories had just been pleasant jokes, they wouldn't have had the power they did It's only insofar as literature actually addresses a universal moral or metaphysical question that these ancient stories take on power or relevance and influence. So it's qua
Right.
philosophy, although the purpose of art is not didactic, as Ayn Rand says. Nonetheless, the power of conveying a moral idea. Aristotle's theory of tragedy is very instructive on this point. He believed that, for example, you can't really have a good tragedy unless the victim is a hero, has virtue. So the story, what makes a tragedy a real tragedy, according to Aristotle, is when
Sure.
virtue suffers because of its virtue. And we're supposed to feel horrified that this virtuous, innocent victim is suffering tragedy. We feel a catharsis. We walk out of the theater, says Aristotle, with a new moral dedication to the truth in an emotional way that maybe a nonfiction treatise on philosophy can never convey.
Well, we will cover a little bit of what you've already said here by jumping to question 2, because after giving that answer, somebody came back at Dr. Peikoff and said, elaborate on your statement that Plato and Aristotle might not have been possible without Homer and Sophocles. What qualities of poetry did this? And Leonard Peikoff answers, well, I was not thinking of them as poets, but of the worldview that they presented. Talking of Homer now, the Greeks created the first literature in the West, as far as we know in the world, that was secular, essentially secular. Everything prior to that had been mystic, oriental, otherworldly, Egyptian, self-abasing of man in favor of another dimension. With Homer came this whole work out of the blue in which man was presented as greater, more glorious, and more moral than the gods. It was, in its context, a shocking degradation of the gods. Even the supreme god, Zeus, was ridiculed, seduced, and drugged by his wife. The afterlife was explicitly condemned in the Odyssey. In the Iliad, one of the characters says, my intellect is just as good as that of the gods. As to the gods, the only thing they have over me is physical force. Achilles, the great hero, was not just a warrior. He was presented as an intellectual, a wit, a musician, and as selfish. He wanted his property or his woman back in the name of justice to him. In fact, in a very generalized way, the Iliad is the same story as Atlas Shrugged. The hero suffers injustice and then says, okay, I'm going on strike. You fight your battles without me. It's just as astounding that this should suddenly appear out of a human history which is all completely the opposite. It's all the distinctive fundamentals of the West. If there were no one like that, if there were no one like the 5th century playwrights, there would be no basis whatsoever. I don't see how you could go into a whole philosophy because you wouldn't even have the idea of this world, logic, or the mind. I can't prove it, but I think someone would have to give the overall worldview, the sense of life, and only then could philosophers start analyzing it.
I can only agree. My favorite example, he gave some good examples there from Homer. My favorite example is when Odysseus is killing a bunch of bad guy enemies, and 2 people come up and ask him for mercy. One is a priest, and the other is a poet. And Odysseus spares the poet and does in the priest. The poet is seen more and more valuable in his mind, perhaps even more connected to the truth in his mind than the priest is. What a culture. And surely that cultural bias has to be the presupposed emotional approach, metaphysical, in terms of metaphysical values, the metaphysical approach, the sense of life of a culture that could produce Plato and Aristotle, and later Euclid and Archimedes, these great men who gave us philosophy and science and an objective method of thought.
Makes you wonder where we would be if the Romans hadn't decided to betray all of that 300, 500 years later, and we enter the Dark Ages.
Romans were not nearly so man-loving in their orientation than the Greeks. And it was unfortunately the worst kind of ideas from Greece, like Neoplatonism, that would take over the Roman Empire and tempt them with horrible forms of mysticism. And at the end of the day, that mysticism would destroy the classical world.
Yes, and subordinate the great men to the empire.
And that was done by means of literature, in effect, a literature telling philosophy. It was by means of literary means that Christianity, for example, became the form of Neoplatonism that took over the Roman world and brought classical civilization to its tragic end.
Well, we were so positive for a moment there, and I'm going to turn it right back around here.
And it works negatively. A culture that could produce a Homer will produce a culture that produces an Aristotle. A culture that produces the opposite will produce the opposite, alas. Philosophy is what controls human history, and there are different ways in which philosophy makes its impression on a culture. And the two primary ones are philosophy proper and the art, which, whether the artist knows it or not, is expressing the deepest metaphysical values of his culture, or his own if he's an original thinker like Ayn Rand.
Yes, we have a great quote from Mozart that Christopher brings up in the chat. Mozart makes the angels think about coming down to earth. I love it when people get their priorities straight.
Right.
And in that regard, I'm going to jump right to question 3, because now it's time to make this personal. Incidentally, the chat is sparse today. Not a lot of action. I see that we've got watchers, but people are quiet. Maybe they're going about their day and enjoying their good lives. But
darn them! How dare you be enjoying your day?
Yes, thank you to those of you who are
nothing more enjoyable than these kind of talks myself, but that shows who I am.
Well, normally, if the chat was as active as usual, I would say right here is when you should be putting in those super chats to support the Ayn Rand Center UK. But it looks like everybody's on the road doing their thing. Oh, Robin says, enjoying in silence. Yeah, I see we've got people watching, but we don't have as many folks talking. And that's good. You do you. You do what's right for you. But I'll take a moment to say, if you're not already a member of the Ayn Rand Center UK, now's the time. Sign up, AynRandCenter.co.uk, click membership at the top, become a member, and put in a few super chats. If you've got a couple dollars to spend, it all goes to support the ARCUK UK, which is doing magnificent work. Talked about that yesterday on my show. It's amazing that 2 years ago, Ayn Rand Center UK, they were out there. They were a great meetup group if you were in London. And now they're second only to ARI in what they do to help spread these ideas and make shows like this possible. So
and I got to say, you appreciate the benevolence, the humanity-loving wisdom of a man like Robert Nasir. All I can say is that you got to check out his programming. You really do. Life on Earth is an invaluable show, and you've been knocking it out of the park, Robert. So if you guys really find value in this kind of programming, please do consider becoming a paid subscriber to Ayn Rand Center UK. I think we are changing the world, and we're going to change the world. So please help us.
And at a minimum, we're saving lives. We're saving my own life. Well, not dying, but, making life worth living. One of our silent listeners just chimed in, Bonnie. We love Bonnie. And she's been such a supporter for so long. She says, you caught me. I can only listen, but enjoying it so much. Thank you for that, Bonnie. And I'm gonna get right into the personal stuff here. We're like, oh, this is all very interesting, but is it important? Well, here we go. Question number 3. Is it wrong or irrational to identify with someone else, like a character in a novel? Now that's interesting, because before he specifies it, I'm like, I identify with all sorts of people. Yes. Novels too. Yes. And what does that mean? Is it second-handed? Is it not true to yourself? What's he getting at here? Well, Dr. Peikoff has a great answer. So I'll give a bit of that, and then we can talk about it. Identifying with a character simply means that you see some important similarity between you and that character and their thoughts, their feelings, and their actions. That's not always so. You might read a book and with great characters or bad characters and not feel any similarity. But sometimes a character is drawn in such a way that you think, wow, we have a lot in common. Even if you have big differences, that doesn't change the fact that the similarities are real and you identify with them. That is perfectly rational. You're simply responding to a fact. And it's certainly not wrong to grasp your similarity to another character. When I read, this is Leonard Peikoff, when I read The Fountainhead as a young teenager, I definitely identified with the character. Now, I'm going to stop the quote right there. Of course, when I was listening to this, I listened to it before I read the text. I expected him to say Howard Rourke. I'm like, no, well, that's what I did, right? He says, no, this is Leonard Peikoff says, I definitely identified with the character Dominique. The common denominator, which I didn't really know at the beginning, was that we both had two qualities. We were both idealists, and we were both bitter at the hopelessness of ever achieving ideals in this world. The latter had been pounded into me when I was very young, so I could certainly sympathize with that viewpoint. I knew that Rourke was right, but I didn't feel that he was right. Of course, I didn't come to do that until I learned from Ayn Rand at the end of the book what Dominique's and my error was. Bit long there, but I had to read the end there because this is the payoff. This is the good, the what for, not just the pleasure of reading this, but what this does for your life. To realize that here's a great character, a magnificent character, but with real challenges, who finds a resolution. And how many of us, how many people still within this philosophy say, what the hell is wrong with the world? And how can I even get by in a world like this? Well, and we read the Fountainhead, and yeah, Dominique, I get it.
Dominique was herself in a bad mood.
Yeah.
Ayn Rand, believe it or not, identified with the flawed character Dominique. I think there's a lot of lessons to be had in that. When I read The Fountainhead, I knew I wasn't Howard Rourke. And on the other hand, I knew that the best parts of me were Howard Rourke. My best self was Howard Rourke. That all that other stuff was the chaff, and that was the wheat. And the value of The Fountainhead and drawing the character of Howard Rourke allowed me to make that distinction. There were times when I frankly, and it's no great pride of mine, on the other hand, I don't think it's a great shame given my Christian upbringing. There were times when I identified with Peter Keating a little bit. At my worst, God, that's kind of social metaphysics, Peter Keating secondhandedness. But in so identifying, I was able to disidentify over time with that and more identify with Howard Rourke. This is true with people in reality. There are people in history and people in my own personal life who I know. Usually it is a part, people are complex things. There are parts of the person. My dear friends are people who I have substantial identification with. They share my values, my sense of life, even if they don't share my explicit philosophy, or they share my explicit philosophy or something. It is because of those shared commonalities, my identification with them. If I identify with them as I do, like Howard Rourke with some of them, gosh, I wish I had a quality like that. I'll find myself imitating them in that way. I found myself imitating Leonard Peikoff as a model for myself, having known him well enough personally to say there are certain characteristics about that guy I want for myself, and I self-consciously emulated them. Did I self-consciously emulate everything about Leonard Peikoff, or do I self-consciously emulate everything about all the people I know that I might? No, but it's like characters in literature. Yes. Find the best, identify with. There's nothing wrong with identifying or disidentifying. There are certainly characters in Atlas Shrugged who I was horrified with. They were the essence of everything that wasn't me. But yeah, what's wrong with identifying? And it's in the process of identifying that we actually get a lot of the moral and psychological juice out of literature. If we're not identifying or disidentifying with the characters, we're not really into and involving ourselves with the psychological and moral drama. That's the only way I have of putting it. Yep. I don't see what's wrong with having heroes.
Minor technical difficulty. I had to wrap up there.
These things will happen.
Yes.
I'm glad you're here without a blackout.
Well, this is actually related to that. But yeah, I love that you are mentioning Peter Keating. There's a joke, and it's made into comedy routines or memes where people say, yeah, he's great. He's a great bad example. And we pick on somebody in that way. But in art and literature, they are great. To say, well, here's a Peter Keating. Oh my God, Keating actually does something that I was doing there, and I need to question that and ask, is that what I want? And do I want the results he got? Or even if I want the results he got, do I want the moral underpinnings of what he did? So yes, bad examples too. And I'm with you in that I identify with, I've said before, I'm sure folks have heard me say, I want to be Howard Rourke when I grow up. But what I really mean is that, I'm on a journey to be more like that. And it's not that I want to, and folks have actually done this kind of thing. So I'm only halfway joking. It's not that I want to dye my hair orange or go into architecture. It's the philosophical premises and even a few style cues of behavior. And I don't think that's second-handed in any way if you adopt it first-handed. That would be like saying, I saw Swing Time and now I'm going to learn to dance. I'm being second-handed because I want to be Fred Astaire. No,
That's insane. No. Right. To be inspired by others is in a way to identify with that value.
Yes.
And so, no, don't deprive yourself of the pleasure of identifying with various characters. Don't beat yourself up if you see at least a part of yourself in a bad character, because that's, part of reality. What Ayn Rand is plugging into is something true about human psychology, is what that means, and getting us to be introspectively aware of the differences. That is a vital role. And if you're not identifying with these characters, like I say, you're really not milking this stuff for what you can get from it.
Yeah, and you're missing out on so much, including the fact that other people also identify with this. You get a real sense of malevolence about the world, and people are not that smart and they're all sheep, whatever your particular version of malevolence is. When you read a great author and you realize other people read this great author, I'm not the only person in the world that reads Cyrano and just becomes a better man that day for having read it. It's transformative, and it's a beautiful thing. And I have to mention that in the context of the next question. But before I do that, thank you to Marvin K out there with a £3 contribution through the super chat. Didn't know if we were getting any super chats today, but the comments are rolling in. And Apollo Zeus, with his usual caustic wit, says, John Galt said he wanted to be me when he grows up. Well, I don't doubt you, and I'm absolutely sure that that's the case. But it's nice to see the chat rolling.
I cannot fail but mention the famous Cary Grant joke. Cary Grant was once asked, about the character he plays, and he said, "Well, everybody wants to be Cary Grant. I want to be Cary Grant."
That's great. That's great. Love that from about 4 different angles. But I'm going to jump to number 4 because this one will be a little more controversial, and yet it's a real quick one. Dr. Peikoff was asked, what is the value of Shakespeare from an objective standpoint? And Leonard Peikoff says, Shakespeare is a good writer, a bad storyteller, and a great poet with clear, definite themes, which he can integrate into his plays, but which are false and have a sense of life which is totally malevolent. These are Shakespeare's essential attributes. And then he says real quick here, I think his virtue is his ability to create memorable characters and fantastic poetry. I think his themes are all wrong, but his stories are uninteresting, and his philosophy is awful. But still, I've read them in small doses. Now, that struck me as really harsh. Well, and I've only read a couple of the comedies, but I've seen a lot of the adaptations. I get what's wrong with Shakespeare, but frankly, I think he sells them a little bit short in that.
Oh, I'm a huge fan of Shakespeare. And in one sense, I enjoy going to see Shakespeare plays. Whether it's Romeo and Juliet or Othello. Othello is one of the great plays that Peikoff himself analyzes as one of the great plays of Western literature. But his analysis is true. Yes. There are many much better storytellers than Shakespeare. His philosophical themes are almost universally wrong and anti-objectivist. I have to say that's true too. The great virtue is that he is addressing philosophical issues. He is at that level of abstraction, whether we agree with it or not. But the biggest virtue is the poetry part. Shakespeare is almost unmatched in English literature in terms of the use of language in poetry, in drama.
Yes.
His power, the power of his just the articulation and conveying his philosophical themes or conveying the psychology. His characters will break into sonnets that are just absolute breathtaking gems of Western poetry. It is the poetry of Shakespeare, the language of Shakespeare, that makes him practically untranslatable for the value. If someone were reading him in Chinese or Russian, I cannot imagine them getting the real value of William Shakespeare, which is in that poetry, as Dr. Peikoff says. But it does address philosophical themes, and some of his characters are just absolutely memorable. From Othello, the play that Peikoff analyzes in his 5 great plays, the character of Iago is one of the most brilliantly drawn villains of all time. Truly an evil person. You have to go to someone like Ellsworth Toohey to find a character so beautifully drawn as an evil, horrific, envy-driven, hate-driven character. Iago is a stupendous portrait, and the poetry of Shakespeare is maybe unmatched in Western drama. So I tend to agree with the evaluation, however harsh it sounds. But Shakespeare had all the effect on the language of drama that he deserves to have. He is the great poet of drama in English literature, in my view.
I tend to think he drew his heroes and villains in the same way that Aristotle defined his philosophy, in just this one little way. Aristotle looked at the great men of the day and the weak men of the day in order to determine, well, what is great, what is good, what is virtue. And Shakespeare has that determinism that tends to lead him into malevolence, but he was looking at what actually happens in the politics and the royalty and the people of the day, and was writing, grand epics about, just what happened to be happening around him. But maybe it's because I credit his, as you say, his language so much, his use of language, and most of it's in dialogue, but it's so magnificent. How many figures of speech, how many turns of phrase that we use today were actually originated by Shakespeare?
Right.
It's fascinating to me. So I agree with Leonard Peikoff on this, although he's so good at what he's good at that I hate to be too critical of him in that regard. Philosophically, he reminds me of determinists. He reminds me of Sam Harris, who thinks nobody chooses anything. Essentially, writing a story is writing a news article. Here's what happened. You are simply a thing that is happening.
Right. And see, that's got to affect your storytelling.
Yeah.
Right. If you don't believe in free will, right, it's going to be an inferior story. It must affect the whole concept of plot. So Peikoff's precise evaluation, I think, is correct, but the way you put it is well too. His use of language is so magnificent.
His language is epic, but his stories aren't.
Exactly, but it's so good that it makes it worth reading, for sure.
Every time I disagree with Dr. Peikoff, at the end I end up agreeing with him. And with that embarrassing thing said, I'll jump right to question 5. Because Dr. Peikoff was asked. I recently watched a big budget sci-fi movie. Okay, so we're going from the Greeks to Shakespeare to sci-fi, that implied that certain people are enlightened beings, possibly aliens, versus humans who are evil and destructive. Well, I mentioned this to a fellow viewer who told me, well, it's just a movie. You're analyzing it too much. How should I have responded? And it's funny because I again, before listening to Dr. Peikoff's answer, I naturally thought, well, how would I have answered somebody who asked me that question? and I love the answer that Dr. Peikoff gives, and I hope most of us would have had a similar answer. Leonard Peikoff says, well, first of all, there is no moral duty to dissect a philosophy out of an artwork. It's presented as a total and can be enjoyed as a total. You certainly can, if you want to, try to define the philosophy of a movie or an artwork or a book. You may find it helps you name more exactly what you liked about the work, or it might be enlightening about the kind of ideas your enemy holds. If philosophy is important to you, then there's a natural tendency to say, well, what did all this mean? And Dr. Peikoff goes on, the guy you're talking about probably doesn't even know what philosophy is. It's a bunch of floating abstractions to him with no tie to action. I don't think a person like that is immoral. I don't think it's even a flaw. He's ignorant of the same things that almost everybody is ignorant of. So how you respond is just something to the effect of, well, I'm interested in philosophy. Okay, well, let's talk about pinochle or whatever. The other possibility is that he is against focus, against abstractions, against thought as such. And he does not want his enjoyment spoiled by some cold, rational analysis. That I regard as immoral. That is a person who finds perceptions relaxing, as long as a conceptual framework is not brought to bear, as long as there's no judgment. Now, that is obviously not the moral approach to life. End quote. So, what do we think about that, James?
Well, that's a really good point. I mean, the fact that a person walks out of a movie and enjoyed it or didn't enjoy it and doesn't have the whole philosophical analysis is neither really here nor there. I went in to watch a movie and have a laugh or thrill or, check out some beautiful actress or something.
We're going back to that conversation again.
Right. Had to sneak that back in. Anyway, yeah, it doesn't say anything that they had this emotional reaction and that they're not philosophically educated or know how to analyze, do a plot theme analysis of a story. That's not a moral issue. And their emotional reaction is their emotional reaction. On the other hand, if a person does have an inherent hostility toward the big ideas, toward thinking about these things, the person could say, I'm not in the mood to analyze it right now. Okay, great. Just enjoy what you enjoyed as an end in itself. Art, the purpose of art is not to teach. It's not didactic. The purpose of art is to enjoy it, like Leonard says, as a whole. On the other hand, there's a whole level of enjoyment that I get from the analysis, and the analysis will then condition my further, perhaps greater appreciation, or perhaps qualified appreciation, or perhaps my disgust with that work once I understand the philosophical meaning, because, as Ayn Rand says, a plot, a story will say something if it's decently constructed, whether the author of that plot or story knows it or not. And when you break down the meaning of the story, like the sci-fi that was used in the example, if it truly is an anti-human screed, if it is saying human beings are just rotten and the only decent people out there are aliens, then there's something that bothers me about that. And that would, no matter what other virtues that film had, having that theme or sub-theme would be something that would thereafter, once identified, bother the bejesus out of me, I have to admit. It would get in the way of my enjoyment of it. If there were other virtues to the film, I could maybe appreciate those other virtues. But analyzing the film, unpacking the film, or the novel, or the painting, or whatever the work of art is absolutely an enjoyable part of it, is absolutely the way to mine it. Just having a great art appreciation teacher have revolutionized my own appreciation, my emotional reactions to something as simple as a canvas, an oil canvas on a museum wall. I'll have an emotional reaction now to it in a way I never did before, because experts have taught me how to look at a painting, if that makes any sense.
It makes perfect sense. And of course, I've had that experience with, for example, Luke Travers takes you through an art gallery. You will never see art the same way again.
I've had that experience. I went to a Bouguereau a tour with Luke. My golly, is he good? Marianne Thuras herself was like that for me too. She really, the late friend of Ayn Rand, she really taught me how to look at a painting or a sculpture and understand it. And I am forever grateful, because now I can't look at visual art the same way. I look at it with an entirely different eye, and I have deeper emotional reactions to it because of that education.
Yes.
So there's no dichotomy between figuring out what the movie means and enjoying the movie. It's, in fact, a way of mining all the values of enjoyment you can get from a work of art.
It is interesting that art is an end in its, like life is an end in itself, and yet it does so many things in addition to that. for example, being the irreplaceable medium for the communication of a moral ideal, which again goes back to what we said about what it means for history, what it means for philosophy.
So are we going to do that poll we had suggested? Have we thrown down?
The poll was already done, and again, art won because it was phrased as well, which came first.
We decided not to do the identifier poll.
Oh, we haven't done that one, have we? I have to look back at our show notes to find out exactly
look back at our show notes,
going to be.
We can do that one. That might be interesting. I don't know how much time we have, but
well, we've got a whole nother. It must be 2022. People are still saying a whole nother. We have a whole other question, and this one is interesting because it's one of those movement questions. If you're in the objectivist movement, so see what you think of this. Is it true that there is a tendency among objectivists to discount the importance of art and to read nonfiction over fiction? I'm curious, James, do you have an answer to that one even before I read part of Dr. Peikoff's answer? Do you see that objectivists say, well, I want fiction, I don't do fiction, I want the nonfiction?
You know, what's funny is that I've known people who were fiction readers until they read Ayn Rand.
Until they read Ayn Rand.
Which is a sad thing.
Wow.
A sad thing. I have read The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. I no longer have any real need for great literature in my life. How can you beat the profound themes, the beautiful poetry, the perfect plots of The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged? I've rung the bell, and I don't need literature anymore. Or people who really think the philosophy, because Ayn Rand places such an emphasis on philosophy, oh, well, you know, she may have had this entertaining way of presenting it, but the real substance has got to be in the nonfiction. There have been people who've told me that all they've really read of Ayn Rand is the nonfiction. And then, of course, there's a huge group of objectivists. Once they become objectivists, all they do basically is read nonfiction, 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 nonfiction. Of course, those are exceptions. There are many objectivists who love our objectivist. There are, I know, dozens and dozens of objectivist artists and dozens of objectivist musicians and objectivist novelists too. So this is just a tendency. There are objectivists a lot of good objectivists who don't fall prey to this. But I think I agree with Peikoff in his answer. There is I think, a general tendency out there among a lot of objectivists to focus more on nonfiction than fiction, or even to downplay the vital role of art.
Yes, I guess now that you mentioned music and think also the visual arts, I have seen that, and it's a phenomenon where a lot of us, for example, discover objectivism. We decide, I'm going to throw away all my rock and roll records and only listen to classical music because that's the right kind of art to enjoy, etc. So yeah, I guess I can see that. Before I get into Leonard Peikoff's answer, though, the poll is up. Which character from the Fountainhead do you most identify with? And it's been brought down to 4 characters here because YouTube has limits on their polls. But who do you more identify with? Howard Roark, Peter Keating? Some people are laughing, but I'm telling you, we all have learned things by thinking about what's that bit of Keating in me? Dominique Franken or Catherine Halsey? That poor innocent gal who was destroyed by her vicious uncle.
What a great selection of characters to choose from, too. Yes. Nice variety. I wonder what I have to be honest, at the end of the day, it is Howard Roark I most identify with. But as I say, there are features of Keating, especially in my past, that I'm able to identify with. There are sometimes features of Dominique, like Peikoff says, that I'm able to identify with. Sometimes I get so disgusted at the state of the world that I almost feel like, why even try? I never get to the point where I want to destroy my favorite statue or go try and undermine Howard Roark's career or something. I've never reached that stage, but I have reached this point of almost resignation where the world looks so bad. And guess what? It's the Fountainhead that pulls me out of that every time.
I see that a lot from people who say the world doesn't deserve earnestness from me. All you get from me are dank memes and rudeness, because that's all the world deserves.
That's sad.
That's not quite Dominique Franken, but it's that notion that the world just isn't good enough for virtue. You
Right.
put it out there, and or the people who say, I'm not going to try to find a career, for example, a professional career, because the government's just going to take half of my money. I'd rather be poor, etc. So there is a fair amount out there, and it looks like our poll results do show 33% for Dominique Frank, and people are identifying with that.
Very interesting, because a lot of people will say of the Fountainhead that the characters are realistic except for Dominique. What a crazy character. She's out to destroy her values. She's trying to undermine Rourke because he's the greatest architect in by her set of values. She destroys her favorite statue. Wow. When you think about that, that's a really hard kind of psychology to wrap your mind around. And yet we have all these people who are identifying with the psychology of Dominique, who is often regarded as the, quote, least realistic, if you will, personality, psychology-wise, in the Fountainhead. In some ways, I think lots of people identify with Dominique in ways they may not even realize. She may be a more realistic character than a lot of readers give her credit for.
Yes, if that sounds startling to anybody out there, do a YouTube search for the earlier Ayn Rand Center UK discussions about the psychology of characters in Ayn Rand's book. Find Andrew Bernstein's discussions of Dominique Franken. There may be more there than meets the eye.
There is no lover of the Fountainhead more than Professor Andrew Bernstein. He always has insights into what is his favorite novel. I agree.
Yes. So, real quick here, we'll give at least part of it because it's a very long answer. Dr. Peikoff's answer too, is it true that there's a tendency among objectivists to discount the importance of art and read nonfiction over fiction? And Leonard Peikoff says, well, I think based on my experience, there is some truth to this. As people see it, they have a choice between modern works and classics. Well, the modern is mostly junk. And the classics for most people are just too long, too hard, too different in setting, and these people want fiction they can read with enjoyment. I think another factor involved in that is that these people compare any potential novel to the works of Ayn Rand and say, well, this is no good, so I'm just going to give up the field. But that is a mistake. There are treasures in general fiction that aren't even romantic novels, let alone The Fountainhead or Atlas Shrugged, but are miles above TV, including the inspiration that they provide. Something nonfiction cannot give you.
Exactly.
He points out real quick here. I gave a lecture which I'll refer you to, titled "The Survival Value of Great, Though Philosophically False, Art." And close quote. Yaron Brook actually mentions that regularly and recommended it the other day. The survival value of great, though philosophically false, art.
We visited that here in videos, the Ayn Rand Center UK. Please go check them out. Your own Brooke covers it. We've covered it in videos here at ARCUK. There's much to say about that. Usually literature is the product of the dominant ideas. And once serious philosophers come on the scene, it is philosophers who start setting the basic agenda. And art generally reflects the dominant ideas of a culture. If you look at, for example, Italian literature from the High Middle Ages, like Dante's Inferno, it's a religious epic that tells the metaphysics of the Catholic world. You go to the Inferno and you go to Purgatory and you go up to paradise and stuff. Within the next 2 centuries, Italian poets will stop talking about religion so much, and they'll be writing love poetry, like Petrarch and Boccaccio. And that tells you the difference between the Middle Ages, even the High Middle Ages, and the Renaissance and the secular orientation. Do I think those men were the creators of the philosophies that they were each expressing? No, but they were the powerful means, transmission belts, by which those ideas were emotionally communicated to Italians 600 years ago, 500 years ago. And there is no substitute for that connection. So we need both. We need both. It is both philosophers like Ayn Rand and Leonard Peikoff and artists like Ayn Rand and these objectivist artists that I referred to, who will be the ones who lead our culture out if our culture has a future.
Yes.
I guess that'd be my way of summarizing this whole thing.
Right. Leonard Peikoff also says, you might say, I want to get my artistic fulfillment from some other arts like music or painting or whatever, and there's nothing whatsoever wrong with that. You certainly don't have to give up fiction. I just think personally that you're missing out on a lot if you do. Now, he also mentions that because of the education system, unlike having somebody like Luke Travers take you through an art gallery, we have grade school teachers taking us through Nathaniel Hawthorne. And we're like, that was a stupid, why would I read the Scarlet Letter if what my teacher had to say about it is all that's in there?
I love the Scarlet Letter.
There's so much great literature out there.
Nothing like a high school literature or English teacher to drain any love you might have for actually what is one of the books I like, Nathaniel Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter. A book I recommend you highly read. It's got philosophical themes. It's a daring book. It had an influence in its age, and it's a well-written book, by the way. No, it's not Ayn Rand, but there's great value to that literature. There really is.
Yes. Incidentally, we just got a new poll now because we go from the Fountainhead to Atlas Shrugged. And which character from Atlas Shrugged did you most identify with on, well, he phrased it, on your first read? Ooh, now that it's kind of hard for me to answer anybody, but on your first read, you feel like you're going through this journey with Dagny Taggart. Maybe Hank Rearden. These are the two characters who don't know what's going on. So, of course, on your first read, it's kind of, and of course, he includes Robert Stadler and James Taggart in there. Now, Stadler, as you've mentioned, we've mentioned, this is the archetypical should have been great but wasn't, and becomes totally evil at the end, as opposed to, for example, in the Fountainhead, we have a character who should have been great, in many ways was, but gives up at the end. At least he doesn't, destroy an entire section of the country and kill countless people, including himself, like Stadler did.
I can't guess what I would have been without Ayn Rand, and so I wonder, would I have ended up a Robert Stadler or a Gail Wynand? Would I have been sent down a path of error? There's no way for me to know. Should he have been, maybe not great, but should he have been at least a lot better than he was? If there were bad ideas. Fortunately, I disidentified with James, my namesake in Atlas Shrugged, James Taggart. I hated him from the outset. I think we're supposed to. He is an irresponsible, unthinking, life-hating creep. From the outset, we hate him. The character by far that I identified with from the beginning, and it's strange because she is the central female character, was Dagny Taggart. The minute I was presented with Dagny Taggart, even from the opening scene, I don't have beautiful legs. And a wonderful scene where you were introduced to Dagny Taggart. We roll up, it's almost cinematic as we roll up her long, sexy legs, because Dagny is the very symbol of motion, right? No, I didn't identify with her in certain ways, but in her sense of life, her approach to ambition, her approach to sex. Fortunately, I'm more like Dagny than I ever was like Hank. Just the way she listens to music and delivers herself to music, and what she loves about music. I mean, so much of Dagny Taggart is me, including her flaw. I am like many Americans. I have a benevolent sense of life, and it was the hardest thing in the world for me to really wrap my head around evil, the reality of evil. That there are people out in this world who hate life, and who truly envy, and who truly hate the good for being the good, and who have no problem nihilistically destroying values. I couldn't even grasp that as an innocent American. And so the lesson of Dagny Taggart was my lesson as well. Don't take evil any more seriously than it needs to be, because it's incompetent. On the other hand, there is evil out there. You have to acknowledge it, take it seriously. To the extent that Dagny is not, you do. If necessary, you have to join the strike. And that was my great lesson from Atlas Shrugged, was the same lesson arc that Dagny goes through. So my answer to that's easy.
Excellent. Well, let's see, where are we at with that poll? Let me bring it down. It looks like, yeah, Dagny Taggart is in the lead at 71%, Hank Reardon at 29%, Chris Smith in the chat. Christopher Smith is an extraordinary musician, so he writes, well, Richard Halley, of course.
Yeah, that's great.
Yes, that's
he was unsatisfied with our choices.
Yes. And Bonnie also acknowledged Hank was a close second. So excellent there. And Christopher comes in with a super chat as well. Thank you for that. Very much appreciated.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Dagny Taggart's interesting too, because she's a woman, and yet it's one of those rare characters where you fall in love with the character, and yet you also kind of want to be the character.
I fell in love with, I have to admit, more than any other female character in all of literature. Dagny Taggart is my absolute favorite. I fell in love with her as a teenager, and I'm still in this one-sided, unrequited love with her. I married the closest thing I could find to it. But I confess, I fell in love with Dagny Taggart.
We always talk about Howard Rourke as the projection of the ideal man. Presumably John Galt is as well, although people feel he's not fleshed out as much. But really, Dagny Taggart is the ideal woman. She really is both incredibly competent, knows what she wants, goes out and gets it. She's also extremely sexual, passionate to the nth degree, but only when real values are involved. Just as she's, well, I was going to compare her to other characters, but she's not. She's completely unique in that regard, and yet totally believable because she's so well painted.
Generous, and all the characters, like Howard Rourke, Dagny Taggart is sui generis in all of literature, a creation unto herself, like Ayn Rand herself was in philosophy and art. Characters you will not meet in nothing like them in any other kind of literature. Howard Rourke and Dagny Taggart. That's my little ad for him.
Excellent. Well, my takeaway from the episode is to kind of question some of my thoughts again about the primacy of philosophy versus art, because I still believe that it all comes down to philosophy, but historically, kind of had to start with art too. So love the back and forth that Dr. Peikoff explains in his answers there, and the discussion of fiction's character. I still identify with Howard Rourke, but not Dagny Taggart is so amazing. James, thank you for another outstanding discussion. I'm really enjoying the series, and it's just so rich. There's so much in this book, keeping it real, bringing ideas down to earth by Leonard Peikoff. Oh, absolutely. And real quick, nope, poll results are the same as before. They were just updated. So James, thank you so much for these and your insights, which you always bring something where I'm like, oh yeah, I didn't even think of that.
Well, thank you. I tried.
And we will do this again. We will do it again next Friday. Everybody have an outstanding weekend.
Peikoff Friday. Yeah.
And we will do it again. Have a great weekend all.
Take care.